Before Noah, another man built an ark. Before Genesis, another flood erased humanity. And thousands of miles away, in India, Greece, China, the Americas, and the islands of the Pacific, people told variations of the same impossible story. So what were they remembering? And why does the flood still happen inside us? Night falls over the ancient city of Shuruppak. A man stands alone beside a wall of reeds. Then a god whispers through it, "Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon your possessions, save the seed of every living thing," and somewhere beyond the city gates, the first drop of rain touches the earth. The flood myth is one of humanity's strangest recurring stories. A civilization becomes corrupt, careless, or dangerously unbalanced. Water rises, the old world disappears. A small group survives, sometimes in an ark, sometimes on a mountain, sometimes through divine warning. And when the waters finally retreat, humanity begins again. Not every culture has a documented flood myth, but versions of this pattern appear across an extraordinary number of historically distant societies. That leaves us with three possibilities. Perhaps ancient people were preserving memories of real catastrophes. Perhaps one powerful story traveled across continents and changed with every retelling. Or perhaps the flood emerged again and again because it represents something universal in the human mind. By the end of this video, we will bring all three possibilities together. But first, we need to return to the oldest surviving version of the story, and to the man who heard a god speaking through a wall. His name was Utnapishtim. Thousands of years before our time, his story was pressed into clay in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. The best-known surviving version appears on Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The tablet now held by the British Museum is a 7th century BCE copy of a much older Mesopotamian tradition. Its resemblance to the biblical flood story caused a sensation when it was deciphered in the 19th century. In the story, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. But one god, Ea, disagrees. Unable, or perhaps unwilling, to warn Utnapishtim directly, Ea speaks to the wall of his reed house. The message is simple and terrifying. Destroy your home. Use its materials to build a vessel. Do not waste time protecting your wealth. Choose life instead. Utnapishtim obeys. He seals the enormous boat with pitch. He brings aboard his family, craftsmen, animals, possessions, and what the text calls the seed of living things. Then the door closes. The sky turns black. The storm arrives with such violence that even the gods become afraid of what they have unleashed. For 6 days and 7 nights, wind and water tear across the land. The old boundaries vanish. Fields become oceans. Roofs disappear beneath mud. Human beings return, as the poem says, to clay. Then, suddenly, there is silence. Utnapishtim opens a hatch. Sunlight strikes his face, and he weeps. That detail matters. He has survived, but survival is not presented as triumph. The world he knew is gone. Eventually, the vessel comes to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim releases a dove, but it finds nowhere to land. He releases a swallow, and it also returns. Then he releases a raven. The raven does not come back. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the waters are retreating. If this sounds familiar, it should. A divinely warned survivor, a massive vessel, a family preserved, animals carried through the destruction, birds released in search of land, a sacrifice offered when the flood is over. The names are different. The gods are different. But the structure is unmistakable, and the Mesopotamian version was already ancient before the biblical narrative reached the form in which we know it. So was the later story borrowed? Possibly. Stories traveled with merchants, prisoners, soldiers, migrants, and priests. Mesopotamia was not an isolated world. Its myths moved through the same routes as grain, metal, language, and empire. But cultural borrowing creates another question. It may explain similarities across the ancient Near East. It does not completely explain why flood stories also appeared in societies separated by oceans, and it does not explain why the story feels meaningful even to someone who has never survived a literal flood. To understand that, we have to stop looking only at the water outside the ark and look at the water inside the human mind. From a Jungian perspective, myths are not simply primitive attempts to explain weather. They are symbolic dramas in which the human psyche reveals its deepest patterns. Carl Jung argued that recurring images in myth and dream could emerge from what he called the collective unconscious, the inherited psychological structures shared by human beings. He did not treat symbols as fixed equations. Water does not always mean exactly one thing. But throughout Jungian thought, deep water and the sea are closely associated with the unconscious, the vast hidden region of the psyche beneath ordinary awareness. And this changes the meaning of the flood. A flood is not merely water. It is water that has escaped its boundaries. The river has abandoned its banks. The sea has crossed the shore. Something that once gave life has become impossible to contain. Psychologically, this is what happens when emotions, memories, instincts, or truths that have been excluded from conscious life suddenly break through. Grief becomes too large to suppress. Anger tears through the personality built to conceal it. A buried memory returns. A relationship collapses. A carefully maintained identity stops feeling real. The unconscious rises, and the old world goes underwater. This may explain why flood myths so often begin with a civilization that has become corrupt, noisy, arrogant, or spiritually empty. The problem is not simply that the gods are angry. The problem is that the existing order has become incapable of correcting itself. It is too rigid to transform gradually. So transformation arrives as catastrophe. Water dissolves distinctions. King and servant, rich and poor, palace and farmhouse, all disappear beneath the same surface. The flood reduces a complicated civilization to one question: what deserves to survive? And that is the meaning of the ark. The ark is not the old world. Utnapishtim cannot place the entire city inside it. Noah cannot preserve every building, institution, possession, or social role. The ark is a container for what is essential: life, memory, relationship, knowledge, potential, the seed from which a different world might grow. In psychological terms, the ark is the inner structure that keeps a person from being completely destroyed during transformation. It may be a moral principle, a relationship you trust, a practice that gives your life rhythm, a truth you refuse to abandon, a small fragment of identity strong enough to cross the chaos. The ark does not prevent the flood. It allows something to survive it. And notice what happens next. The vessel lands on a mountain. Symbolically, the survivor emerges at a higher level. The world is seen from a new perspective. Then the birds are released. They move between sky, earth, and water, between spirit, reality, and the unconscious. The first birds return because the new life is not ready. Transformation cannot be rushed. Then the raven finds land. Consciousness finally discovers somewhere solid enough to stand. The flood myth is therefore not merely a story of destruction. It is a story of psychic death and rebirth. The old identity is dissolved. The essential core is preserved. And a new relationship with life becomes possible. This is also why the story uses water rather than only fire. Fire destroys by consuming form. Water destroys by dissolving it. And yet water is also the source of life. It surrounds us before birth. It nourishes crops. It cleanses wounds. It can drown us, and it can renew us. The flood is terrifying because the same force represents both death and creation. It is the grave and the womb at the same time. But this raises a more personal question. What does any of this have to do with someone living now, thousands of years after Utnapishtim? More than we might want to admit, because almost everyone eventually experiences a flood. Your flood may never arrive as rain. It may arrive as a phone call, a diagnosis, the end of a marriage. The death of someone you believed would always be there. The sudden loss of a career that had become your identity. Burnout after years of telling yourself that you could keep going. Or the quiet realization that the life you successfully built is not a life you actually want. Before the flood, your world feels permanent. You know who you are because you know your routine, your relationships, your position, your plans, and the story you tell about your future. Then the water rises. One structure disappears after another. And you discover that many of the things you called yourself were only the landscape around you. This is why periods of radical change can feel like psychological annihilation. It is not only that something happened to you. The version of you who understood the world before that event may no longer exist. And here, the myth offers an uncomfortable lesson. When the flood comes, you cannot save everything. Utnapishtim is told to abandon his possessions. That may be the most psychologically honest sentence in the entire story. Transformation always demands a selection. Some identities belong to the world that is disappearing. Some ambitions were built to impress people who are no longer present. Some habits protected you once but now keep you trapped. Some beliefs must drown because they cannot live in the world that comes next. The question is not, how do I keep my entire old life intact? The question is, what belongs in the ark? Which relationships remain real when your status disappears? Which values still guide you when no one is watching? Which abilities can travel with you into an unknown future? Which truth about yourself have you been avoiding because accepting it would force your life to change? This does not mean that suffering is secretly good. Flood myths do not deny horror. Utnapishtim survives and still sits weeping. Being transformed does not make the destruction painless. But the myth suggests that pain and meaning can exist at the same time. Something can be genuinely lost, and something else can still be carried forward. The greatest mistake after a personal flood is attempting to rebuild the exact same city on completely different ground. People often do this. They recreate the same relationship with a different person. They enter a new workplace but repeat the same self-destructive pattern. They recover from burnout and immediately reconstruct the life that caused it. They survive the flood, then rebuild the conditions that summoned it. The myth asks for something harder, not restoration. Renewal. You do not return to the old world. You become the ancestor of the next one. And this may be why flood stories have survived for thousands of years. They do not promise that catastrophe can always be prevented. They promise that destruction is not always the end of the story. But psychology alone cannot explain everything. These myths did not emerge in empty space. Ancient people lived beside rivers that could erase entire settlements. They watched coastlines change. They saw storms, tsunamis, broken dams, and seasonal floods become catastrophes. Which brings us back to the original mystery. Were these societies imagining the same psychological symbol, or were they remembering actual water? The answer may be both. In ancient India, Manu discovers a tiny fish. The fish asks for protection and warns him that a devastating flood is coming. Manu cares for it as it grows larger and larger, eventually revealing itself as Matsya, an incarnation of Vishnu. Manu builds a boat and preserves the seeds of life. When the flood arrives, the great fish guides the vessel to safety. Again, the world is destroyed. Again, something essential is preserved. Again, life begins from a surviving seed. In Greek mythology, Zeus sends a flood against a corrupted human age. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive inside a chest. When the water recedes, they are told to throw the bones of their mother behind them. They understand that the mother is earth, and her bones are stones. The stones become human beings. Here, rebirth does not come from animals or grain, it comes from the earth itself. In the Maya Popol Vuh, the gods create wooden people who can speak but possess no real understanding or gratitude. They are destroyed by a flood. The story is not simply about human wickedness. It is about a form of humanity that looks alive but lacks an inner soul. In a traditional Chickasaw account, nearly all life is destroyed by water. One family survives alongside pairs of animals. When the flood retreats, a raven appears carrying part of an ear of corn. The bird does not merely announce dry land. It returns with the future of agriculture, the possibility of civilization beginning again. And in China, the pattern changes in a revealing way. The great hero Yu does not primarily survive by escaping the water. He learns how to direct it. Rather than simply constructing barriers, he is remembered for opening channels and allowing the water to flow toward the sea. The Chinese flood tradition therefore becomes a myth of civilization through intelligent adaptation. Chaos is not defeated by denying it. It is given a path. A major flood around the Yellow River has been dated to roughly 1920 BCE and has been proposed as a possible historical background for the Yu tradition, though the connection remains debated among researchers. That debate matters. There is no strong geological evidence that one flood covered the entire planet within human history. And we do not need one global flood to explain the stories. Most early civilizations developed near water. Rivers created fertile soil, transportation, trade, and food. They also overflowed. For a community whose known world consisted of one valley, one coastline, or one river plain, a regional disaster could genuinely feel like the destruction of the entire earth. Survivors would tell their children. Their children would preserve the warning. Over generations, a historical event could become sacred memory. The river becomes the anger of a god. A survivor becomes the chosen ancestor. A hill becomes the mountain where humanity began again. The event becomes a story. The story becomes a ritual. The ritual becomes a myth. But real catastrophes are only one layer. Some flood stories certainly spread through cultural contact. The Mesopotamian and biblical narratives share too many detailed elements to ignore the possibility of literary inheritance. Other stories may have developed independently because different societies faced the same danger. And beneath both processes lies the universal human experience of psychological collapse and renewal. So the most convincing answer is not one flood. It is three forces working together: memory, migration, and mind. Memory preserved real encounters with catastrophic water. Migration carried stories across trade routes, borders, languages, and empires. And the human mind transformed those stories into a universal drama about the destruction of an old order and the birth of a new one. That is why the details change, but the emotional structure remains. The Mesopotamian survivor preserves the seed of life. Manu is guided by a divine fish. Deucalion recreates humanity from stone. The Chickasaw raven returns with corn. Yu gives the water a path. Different cultures do not merely copy the same story. They answer the same question in their own way. When the world you understand is gone, what will you carry into the next one? The flood myth has survived because it is three stories at once. It is a memory of nature's power. It is a warning that every human order can become fragile. And it is a psychological map for the moments when life dissolves the identity we thought would last forever. The myth does not promise that everything can be saved. It asks us to choose what is worth saving. So imagine that the waters are already rising, not outside your home, but inside the structure of the life you have built. What would you place in the ark? Which relationship, value, skill, memory, or truth must survive? And perhaps the more difficult question, what would you finally allow the water to take? Share your answer in the comments and subscribe to Archetype Unbound for more journeys into the myths, symbols, and hidden patterns that continue to shape the human mind. Because the oldest stories are not dead. They are waiting for the moment your life makes them true.